Welcome to Forum 360, a global outlook with a local view. We are a nonprofit grant and donation funded program that depends on volunteer hosts who present a wide variety of topics. You can follow us on radio WONE FM 97.5 and WAKR AM 1590. We can be viewed on Hudson Cable Television in Hudson, Ohio, and on Western Reserve Public Media Fusion, Spectrum Channel 993. And you can see us on YouTube. To find out more about us, go to forum360.org. I'm Pat Simons, your host for today's program. There is an abundance of literature written about the Second World War, but the closer to home, the more personal the content. And so it is with the book World War II Akron. Author Tim Carroll, who is Akron born, raised, and educated, shares stories that coincide with a timeline of historic events. He shows us the impact of World War II on Akron and surrounding areas. He honors the contributions of local industries and the spirit and sacrifices made by the people. It is my pleasure to welcome Tim Carroll, author of World War II Akron.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Tim, so let's start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write this book.
Sure. I have a history degree, and my grandfather, when he passed away in 1997, left behind hundreds of World War II letters. So when we finally decided to go through them, I put them in chronological order, and I was kind of stunned when I read the first one because he signed it 364 more days. We were always told he volunteered, and that's when I realized he was drafted. And I knew he was in the military until 1945, so to see him write it 364 more days, March 1st, 1941, I learned that there was a pre-Pearl Harbor draft where 1 million men were drafted before Pearl Harbor, and that's how I started down the journey.
Oh, that's a revelation, isn't it? Well, the stories and anecdotes that you tell about your family and others are very detailed. The book is chock full of archived materials, different articles, photos, political cartoons. How did you research and collect all this material?
The newspaper archives were one of my best sources. And I don't think I could have even done this as well as I did if it was 10 years or so ago, because now you can access the newspaper archives online from your home. So that really helps you research and really find a lot of the material. So the newspaper archives were my best source. I did use some library resources and some archives at colleges. But again, the newspaper archives, which again, 10 years ago, you probably couldn't have accessed. So this is probably a new type of book where you get more thorough research from the time period.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Now, when you say newspaper articles, are you speaking specifically of Akron Beacon Journal?
Akron Beacon Journal, but I did use some other sources across the country, but primarily Akron Beacon Journal, which did a fantastic job of the time period. Their coverage was really good. In my opinion, one of the best papers in the country. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, your grandfather, Private John Carroll's letters, talks about frustration because he felt ill-informed about their movements. He discerned a gap between the political decision makers and those who served. At times, he had low morale, and he was especially upset when his draft was extended for another 2 years. Do you think his feelings were common among the soldiers? Yeah,
and that's what he documents in his letters. And I even mentioned a Life magazine article in there where the reporter talks to 400 soldiers who were all very unhappy at the time. The generals and the politicians are all saying that the men are happy and they're being trained well. They're testifying about that before Congress, but the soldiers can't speak for themselves. They're in the military, other than talking to these reporters. So there was definitely a disconnect, and the generals are trying to claim that everything's going well, but the soldiers really are not being trained that well before Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So journalism played a huge role.
A huge role,
in bringing truth to the situation.
Yep.
You had some really interesting terms I'd never heard before referring to the draft, how they conscripted soldiers.
Sure.
You used terms like Boy Scouts, old man, fathers. What did those categories mean, and how did they impact those individuals?
Yeah, so the first draft was the pre-Pearl Harbor draft, where they drafted men aged 21 to 35, and then 1 million men were drafted before Pearl Harbor. They did change it briefly in July 1st, 1941. They changed it to 21 to 27. So those men were required to serve a year, and they were subject to recall for 10 years. They did release some men after they served a year, because they started drafting in October of 1940. But they were immediately recalled to service by February 1942 after Pearl Harbor. So they would have been subject to recall for quite some time had they been let out of the military. The next draft that they started was after Pearl Harbor. It was age 20 to 45. And a lot of people don't realize you could have gotten drafted up to age 45. I documented several men from Akron who were killed in action in their 40s who were drafted. It wasn't common, but they did draft that high. And then since they want to bolster their numbers, and young men are typically physically fit, they did eventually debate throughout 1942 and start drafting men as young as 18, which Americans weren't happy about, so they nicknamed it the Boy Scout draft. And there were several young men, as you read in the book, that were drafted while they were in high school and were killed in action before they had graduated high school. The draft took a turn from there. And by the end of 1943, and this really surprised me in my research, they started drafting fathers age 18 to 37. You even probably saw in the book one of the most famous fathers to be drafted was Ohio State's head coach Paul Brown, drafted with 3 kids. But I even found 3 fathers of 5 who were drafted and killed in action. There was not really a limit on the amount of kids you had. And they didn't keep the fathers off the front line. So I never heard that before, that they were drafting not only married men, but men with kids.
Oh, that's really fascinating. At one point, didn't they talk about even lowering the age to 17?
They did debate lowering the age to 17. They never went through with it. They typically would take some age 38 to 45 if they were really desperate. But usually the age 38 to 45, later in 1943 and through 45, they were trying to force those guys to go into defense jobs or help with farming, because they needed help with farming. So they would say, we don't want to draft guys that old, but we will unless you get a defense job or get a job farming. But they did debate lowering the draft age to 17, but never did it.
Yeah. But even at age 18, some of those young men were still in high school.
Yeah, and I even met a World War II veteran the other day who said he only had 1 month's training before they sent him overseas. So a lot of times it was only 3 to 4 months training. Congress did act after the fighting was pretty much over. They did require 6 months training for these young men.
I think that was something that really hit me, is that a lack of basic training, and combine that with youth and inexperience, could set them up for quicker death.
Yeah, I mean, they're being set into horrific combat and without training. That's one of the reasons why some of the paratroopers said they joined the paratroopers, is you got more training by being in the paratroopers, so they thought their odds of survival would be better.
Oh, that's interesting. You talk about some canine draftees.
Yeah, they weren't draftees, I guess, but I guess they weren't volunteers either. They can't volunteer yourself. But there was a Dogs for Defense program where local families and families across America could donate their dog, and people did. I was talking at a presentation the other day. There was a Barberton Dalmatian who returned after 15 months overseas, 15 pounds lighter. Family greeted him at the train station like a normal soldier, and we even had a local vet, Clinton Barrett, who was a longtime member of the Akron School Board, who was a World War I veteran, but in his older age, he was still in the reserves, and he supervised animals out of Camp Fort Robinson in Nebraska. And so it was interesting to learn more about him.
But even they had basic training.
Yeah.
And then I understand they had to do a reversal of that training to help them come home and readjust.
Yeah, if they did often give them back to families, and they would let families know we've detrained them, but we can't be responsible if they do bite you, because they were trained to be aggressive at times, and we can't guarantee that won't happen.
And didn't they receive medals?
They did.
For accommodation?
Yeah, they would receive usually discharge papers that said where they were, what ribbons they won, or medals. Yeah.
Oh, that's really a prideful thing, isn't it? Citizens varied in their opinions of the war, especially during whatever phase they were in, but it always felt like they were very patriotic. They remained patriotic.
Sure.
So given the disparity between what the politicos were trying to tell the public was going on and journalism, so let's talk more about what importance the journalists played in the truth.
They did a good job of documenting the war. I think they really were a voice of reason. Even the political cartoons you see in there, I thought Webb Brown did a good job with his cartoons of being a voice of reason, trying to hold the politicians accountable, because they're, believe it or not, they're not always telling the truth.
Oh, really?
And yeah, they did a fantastic job of just documenting what Akron was doing at the time. And I also was very impressed, because the casualties were so high, that the reporters were so good at talking to families about if their loved one was a prisoner of war, missing, wounded, or
Yes.
killed in action.
Yes.
And because a lot of families do want to tell that story, they want their loved ones to be remembered.
Right.
And that also helped with my research. If you could find information on those soldiers, it helps me tell their story. So.
Well, that's really interesting. And the method that they contacted the families was not always very efficient, it sounded like.
Yeah, they were always notified by telegram, which certainly isn't the most personal way. You'd knock at the door and you never knew what was in that telegram. And especially if you had someone missing in action, you might fear the worst. So that wasn't the most personal way to do it. I don't think until the Vietnam era that they started sending soldiers to knock at doors and comfort families. But yeah, every time someone was killed in action, it was typically a telegram. Sometimes there was one woman I spoke about. She had not hundreds, but a stack of letters in her mailbox that were marked deceased.
Oh, no.
So she found out that way, but it
Oh,
was
no.
kind of dramatic because as she was stunned there on the porch, a telegram boy did walk up to her and hand her a telegram saying her son was killed in action. So you sometimes found out in odd ways.
Well, thankfully they didn't have Twitter.
Yeah.
That would have been horrible.
Yeah.
Now, during this period of time, Akron's industries kind of had to morph and change.
Yeah.
And they became major manufacturer suppliers in the war. And a lot of new inventions
Sure.
emerged. Do you want to talk about their contribution? a
Yeah,
bit?
it was really immense. Akron was the 12th industrial center in America, second in Ohio. Goodyear aircraft sprang up overnight and went from about 30 workers to 30-some thousand, where they made the Corsair airplane was the only complete plane they made, but they made a ton of parts for aircrafts, made pretty much just about any plane that served. Even the B-29, which was used in the Pacific, even dropped a nuclear bomb. Akron made a significant amount of parts for the B-29. Goodyear aircraft also made the blimps. 154 blimps were made by Goodyear, and they were all made by Goodyear. Every blimp that served in the Navy, hunting subs, Japanese and Nazi subs, were made by Goodyear. Firestone made anti-aircraft guns, and they made 80% of the anti-aircraft guns for the entire Allied nations combined.
Wow.
And even one fun story in there is I found a picture that was marked top secret when I was at the Beacon Journal looking through photos. When I did research on it, because it was just an ordinary anti-aircraft gun, I found it was inflatable. So Akron and Firestone, Goodyear and Firestone made a ton of inflatable weapons that were used to fool the Nazis on D-Day. They surrounded General Patton with inflatable weapons and
Okay.
trucks and landing craft and planes, and that really worked. And the Nazis, even on D-Day, they held some of their soldiers in reserve, thinking Patton was invading here with his inflatable army.
Isn't that interesting?
So it did help save lives, but that's one
Okay.
thing that was declassified in December of 1945. Synthetic rubber was big. Obviously, tires was everything runs on tires, planes, you name it. So Akron's tire output was immense. What else was there? Gas masks, life rafts. The life raft, you could survive on the ocean. One group of people survived for over 80 days.
Wow.
If you've read the book or seen the movie Unbroken, 47 days those guys were on the life raft. That was invented by J. Frank Good. So I try to make it interesting by telling stories of people who survived on life rafts. And they also made life jackets, life belts, anything rubber, parachutes, you name it. So.
Well, it sounds like quite a contribution.
Yeah.
And it took a large workforce. You've just turned into Forum 360, and I'm your host, Pat Simons. Today we're talking with local author Tim Carroll about his newly released book, World War II Akron. So what I heard is the phrase was kind of like, if the rubber's hitting the road, it's likely Goodyear. And the whole thing about the rafts, I don't think people really understood them, and the role that the blimps played as well, that they could actually be used with dropping bombs and things. That was really interesting, besides being protection.
Yeah, they were armed with machine guns and depth charges to fire on subs. Typically, they called in other planes or ships that move faster, but they could hover over water, they see deep and see the subs. And
oh, now that's interesting.
So they were instrumental as in the early 1942, the Germans were sinking some shipping around the East Coast, and the blimps were instrumental in getting them out of there. And as the blimps started doing that, the subs would go away from the blimps. So they even were sinking ships in the Gulf of Mexico, so we had to put squadrons of blimps in the Gulf of Mexico, and eventually all the way down to Brazil. Essentially, the Germans kept moving south to get away from the blimps, the sink shipping where there's no protection.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
the more blimps that were there, the more protected the ships were.
Now, I wondered if you could describe, because we just talked about the explosion of jobs and the need for these supplies and manufactured
Sure.
products. What was going on with the workforce at that time?
Really, before even Pearl Harbor, unemployment pretty much ends, especially in Akron. The population booms to, they estimate, around 280,000 or higher, which my research, would verify that. So you really could get a job in the defense industry. We're building up our own military because we're scared we're going to get involved in the war, but we're also supplying the other allied nations that get fighting against the Germans and the Japanese.
Okay.
So the population really was booming, and yeah, if you wanted a job, that's one of the things those pre-Pearl Harbor draftees were disappointed about, is they're making $21 a month in the Army, and a lot of people at home are making money in the factories.
But I also understand that people immigrated.
Yes.
Or migrated, I
Yeah,
should
people
say,
came across
to-
the country to
yeah.
get jobs in Ohio. Even I
Yeah.
saw recruiters down in Texas, families in Texas moving up to Akron, Ohio.
It must
So,
have been a difficulty to say, I'm from my hometown, I'm off at war, but these people are coming in and taking these good paying
Yeah,
jobs.
yeah.
I see where that was happening. Now, women were not conscripted at that point in
Mm-hmm.
time, or were allowed to join the regular army. What kind of contributions did they make during this period of time?
in the military or in the workforce?
In the workforce in particular.
In the workforce, they were drafting so many men, they were running out of soldiers, so they really needed different groups to step up, and one of them was women. You had so many women working in the factories. Some of them were relatives, sisters, mothers, wives of these men. So that's where you get Rosie the Riveter. She's riveting together, planes at Goodyear aircraft, and they had a tough task ahead of them because, again, there weren't many men at home, so they're doing everything. You got to wait in the ration line to get your food. The shopping hours aren't very good. Transportation's bad. There's no child care centers. So they really had to be creative back then. And women had a lot on their shoulders in the workforce.
I thought it was interesting. One of the little anecdotes you mentioned is sometimes they brought the children to work and the security staff watched the kids.
Yeah.
It wasn't a great situation, but at least they were near work and somebody
Yeah.
was watching them.
Yeah, Goodyear had their own police force, so sometimes the cops at the gate were watching the kids for a few hours till somebody could come get them. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm surprised I could find security people who
Yeah.
wanted to do that. World War II brought an impressive list of dignitaries, and we have an impressive list of famous people
Sure.
who came forward in Akron during
Yeah.
World War II. You want to talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of them's on the cover here. Shorty Fulton's with his friend General Jimmy Doolittle.
Oh,
so I didn't
okay.
know General Doolittle was such a prominent visitor to Akron starting in the 1920s, and he came throughout his life. They had about a 50-year friendship. So that was one of the surprising stories to me, is you have General Doolittle coming here so much, and Shorty Fulton joined the Army at age 50 because he had such an outstanding friendship with General Doolittle. This is the actress Marlene Dietrich speaking outside of the Goodyear Air Dock on Jeep Day 1942. She rode all over town in a Jeep. I have a story about Clark Gable's service, since he was in Akron just before he left for Hollywood. And after his wife died in a plane crash, he joins the military at age 42. Kai's Beach over here is a Marine combat correspondent, and I found his story very interesting because he was involved. He witnessed the flag raising on Iwo Jima, and he actually is featured in the movie Flags of Our Fathers. And a lot of people from Akron don't know his story.
And he was a journalist.
He was
right?
a journalist at the Beacon Journal before the war, and then he was also a journalist after the war.
You also had a really intriguing picture of John S. Knight with Eleanor Roosevelt, and a really cool picture of Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
Both appeared here, or at least were very well connected through various dignitaries.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this incredible archive, this treasure trove of archive photos and political cartoons. How did you choose what you put in the book, and do you find this collection somewhat unique?
I definitely find it unique. It was a tough choice because I put over 100 pictures in the book, which was about the limit. There was some stuff they wouldn't let me put in. And there were some photos I was interested in, but you're like, all right, you got to choose. Do you like this one better?
Is this the publisher making that
Yeah, the publisher
cut?
making that
Okay.
decision. So I did have 12 photos with John S. Knight, who was such a prominent figure. I love documenting his history, as you said, with Eleanor Roosevelt, which was an outstanding photo outside of the Akron Armory. And then you have other photos with him with General Eisenhower, President Truman, Admiral Nimitz. Even in the post-World War II section, I wanted to document his prominence. So he's with President Johnson, President Kennedy. But the way I found it is Again, accessing the Beacon Journal archives, I was able to find a lot of photos that were in the paper, so I knew they existed. So I went to the Beacon Journal, and they were great to work with, and I searched the archives pretty thoroughly. I mean, I spent weeks going there, probably for several months, off and on.
You were on a first-name basis?
Yeah. So I was searching through the archives and found a ton of photos, and I also went to the University of Akron archives. The cartoons I came across by chance because I was researching so much.
What I was struck by the cartoons, I thought you could write a 3-column article to make your case, or you could take a cartoon and say it in few words and illustration.
Yeah.
They're very powerful.
Yeah, the cartoons were great. They helped me make a point, and they also, make it look like, that I'm not making anything up. That, people did think this at the time, and you can see this cartoon, in which Webb Brown, who was a Spanish-American War veteran, he retired in 1945 after 46 years of cartooning. So I really think he was one of the best in the country at the time, and I'm thrilled to have his cartoons in there because they have not been reprinted since the late 30s and 40s. So this is the first opportunity the public has to look at some of those, what I consider the best cartoonists in the country.
Well, I can tell you it's quite a treasure trove seeing that. I was wondering if you learned anything new and surprising from doing the research.
There was definitely a lot. The draft was one thing. Like I said, I didn't know they were drafting fathers, and I didn't know they were drafting. A lot of people at my presentations are surprised they're drafting up to age 45, being drafted while you're in high school. Goodyear Blimp serving in the Navy, I certainly didn't know about that. There was really a ton of unique history, and I tried to put that in the book that I think Americans as a whole will enjoy, and certainly the community of Akron and Northeast Ohio will enjoy the book. But there's a lot of great World War II history. I think you could learn a lot from the book.
I was thinking that I can't look in the sky and see a Goodyear Blimp quite the same way.
Yeah.
Today, when we see them out
Sure.
there. The stories were very personal, many about triumph and many about losses. Was there a particular story that stuck with you?
It's tough to say. I mean, I think like I said, it really grabbed my attention of these young men being drafted and being killed in action. Kind of the devastation it caused a lot of families, and the fathers being drafted. 3 fathers of 5 were killed in action. And they weren't the only ones. There were some with 4 kids, or even if you have 1 child, that's pretty devastating for those families. So you really, you had to participate in this war, and that really kind of grabbed me. As if you didn't volunteer, you had to join, and a lot of guys did volunteer knowing that they were going to be drafted anyway. So it's really a all hands on deck war, and that really just kind of grabbed me. I can imagine, war, a lot of veterans say how difficult it is, that it's not fun. So I can't imagine not having the option of not going, that you have to be involved, and there's a good chance you're going to be sent in some horrific combat.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
And I thought you were so poignant in how you relayed the stories of mothers as they received the news and how they reacted. Sometimes only sons.
Yeah.
Some families lost more than 1 son.
Yeah, that's my casualty research was very important, I feel. July 1st, 1944, not one family from the Summit County had lost more than 1 son, but fast forward a year later, 15 families had lost more than 1 son.
It really escalated at that point, didn't it?
Yeah, I have a chapter called The Deadliest Year, and the way I was able to do that is I went through our list of 1,500 some war dead. I spent months figuring out the dates they were killed in action, and so I start with the first person killed in 1941, and I have a date for everyone that was killed from Summit County, which helped me determine the deadliest month, the deadliest days, and the deadliest year. So I do consider that to be important research that helped document what happened.
Oh, that's interesting. And I'm wondering if anyone has done that kind of work.
They have not, to my knowledge. I mean, even if you Google it, like how many people have died from New York or Boston in World War II, you won't get a number. So I consider it unique and first of its kind research. So I hope it catches on and will help historians. And I have talked to a few schools. So I'm hoping some schools will pick up the book, and I really think it will be a great learning tool for high schools and college.
Well, if the audience wants to go on your website, www.worldwar2akron.com, they can see speaking engagements that you have coming up. By the time this program is televised, that wouldn't be until May, but you will be keeping those rolling during that period of time. Also, if they want to buy your book, they can buy it through historypress.com, Amazon, or through the worldwar2akron.com website. I want to thank you so much for coming today and sharing your new book. I think that I was surprised reading it that there are so many levels of learning that can go on through this book, and it's very rich in history, and I feel like I know you a little bit through that book too, because of the choices you made.
Thanks.
So I want to wish you good luck on your book tour.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
You're very welcome. In the book World War II Akron, author Tim Carroll's storytelling captures the contributions and sacrifices of Akron's people and how they rose to meet a great challenge through many triumphs and many losses. We are shown Akron as an industrial giant that employed thousands of people who helped the war effort through invention and manufacture of futuristic technologies and products, and it put Akron on the map. We are treated to stories of dignitaries, heroes, and daredevils, human and canine, from those years. The book is a treasure trove of archive photos and political cartoons. In the book, Bob Hope is quoted from a speech given to 20,000 people at the Rubber Bowl. "You people here tonight have mixed your sweat with GI sweat in every battle since Pearl Harbor. Your work shortens the war." He went on to say, "If you talk long enough with a man, you find out that nobody in the world hates war quite as much as the man who has to fight it." This is Pat Simons for Forum 360. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.